So a typical kitchen might, in its accounts, have a line for say 3%, maybe 5% of all the food that gets purchased being wasted. But in reality, our data captured in over 1,000 kitchens shows that the real number is likely to be between 5 and 15% of all the food that's purchased. And in some cases, that can be 20% or more. So if we're able to cut that in half, that's a significant cost saving for the business while you're also doing the right thing for the environment as well.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Clean Techies, the podcast. This is episode 39, and today's conversation is with David Jackson, who is the marketing director at Winnow. That's Winnow. Just to make sure everybody gets the spelling there. And Winnow is quite interesting company that is helping commercial restaurants to reduce food waste. And of course, when they reduce their food waste, they're reducing their carbon footprint. He had a lot of stats for us in the conversation, which we'll get to. But generally speaking, very interesting conversation with David today. It gave us a lot of insight into space. I think it was interesting for me. I started out my career kind of very early on working in food service, so very interesting to hear these things. Before we do get into the show, of course, as always, want to make mention to our sponsors, NextWave Partners, who make this happen. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition and recruitment across the climate tech, renewables, ESG, and technology spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you personally are looking to make a career change, please do consider reaching out to NextWave for those needs. You can reach them through their website at next-wavepartners.com, or you can reach out to one of their consultants that works in your space and region directly via their LinkedIn page, which is, again, NextWave space partners. So thank you so much for joining us today. And without further delay, let's get into the show.
All right. Welcome to the show, David. How are you doing today?
Yeah, very good, man. Good to be here.
Great. Well, I'm really excited for this. Actually, I think this is a technology or a topic that we've not really touched on at all on the show. So why don't you just give us a quick background on yourself, where you're at with Winnow, and let's kind of hear the backstory and how you ended up at Winnow.
Sure. So my name's David. I'm the marketing director at Winnow. So at Winnow, we develop artificial intelligence tools to help chefs in kind of large kitchens. So think a staff restaurant, a cruise ship, a casino, or a kind of big hotel or resort to run more profitable and sustainable operations by cutting food waste in half. My background is I'm a kind of marketeer by trade. So I started off in the consumer space, marketing credit cards at American Express. And I decided pretty early on in my career that I wanted to do something meaningful, something with purpose. And I moved into the not-for-profit sector initially, but I've been with Winnow now since 2014. The business has been going since 2013. And what I really like about working at this business, which I'm sure we'll get into, is we're scaling a technology that can have massive implications, both on a kind of commercial scale, but also on an environmental one. So that's why I love my job. I'm in a fortunate position to get up every day, really kind of energized and motivated, and really happy to be having the conversation today.
Yeah, I think it can't be understated how important it is to be in something that you enjoy doing, because if you're not, like, getting out of bed is tough, right? But I guess I may be curious, before we get into too deep to things, what was the specific point where you kind of what was the epiphany that you had, that you realized, hey, I want to do something different that really kind of makes an impact? How did that come about?
So I think there's a couple of phases to my career in that respect. So the first kind of epiphany was kind of transitioning through, kind of marketing something fairly generic in financial services and thinking about, okay, how do I apply that to something that does some good in the world? And I was volunteering for a suicide prevention hotline. And I remember thinking, well, I'm trained as a marketeer. That's what my degree was in. That's what my kind of graduate traineeship was in. But how can I kind of think about using some of those skills to make a positive impact? And at the time, back in the early kind of 2000s, really, if you wanted to make an impact, you went into the third sector, the charity sector. And so the way that you sell a credit card is pretty similar to the way that you solicit a donation. And so that was where it's a pretty easy transition through to working for the third sector. But I think in recent times, so in 2014, I left my job working at a communications agency that specialized in kind of fundraising and communications for charities. And I went to stay in Kenya, and I set up a social enterprise in Kenya. And I saw the kind of impact that you could have by starting a business. And I think it's pretty common currency now that businesses with purpose can have a massive impact, need to have a massive impact when it comes to both kind of people and planet. But I think that was a real epiphany for me, thinking, right, well, how can I use my skills and experience now to try and move the needle forwards? And I think, like lots of people now, we're looking for businesses that, have something higher than, just making money. And at the time, kind of technology for good in 2014 was just kind of starting, and this idea of creating scalable new technologies that can both kind of create value but also do something positive was where I ended up. So lucky to have found Winnow, and that's really what we're trying to do today by scaling up a technology to fight food waste.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting. I guess for me, I've never really known a world where there's not a good amount of businesses that are literally their purpose is for good. So that's interesting to think that, not too long ago, many people didn't have the option to really work in something that was really truly kind of mission driven. How did you end up finding Winnow? I'm kind of curious, like in the early days, because
Yeah.
you're in the UK, correct?
Yeah, I'm based in London. Winnow was founded in London
Okay.
in 2013 by two Americans, but they were based in London when they founded the company. I met one of the founders at a social enterprise event at Oxford University, and I think I was actually reflecting on this over the weekend, right? Like you have to be present, you have to turn up to find your opportunities. Like your that kind of old saying that luck is the meeting of preparation and kind of opportunity.
Hmm.
And I remember at the time I hadn't seen my girlfriend for a couple of weeks. We were supposed to be kind of having a weekend together, and I saw this conference that was happening on the Sunday, and I can remember sending her the message saying, hey, listen, I'm really sorry, I'll make it up to you, but I feel like this is really important for me to go. And I went to this conference where lots of different social enterprises, lots of different kind of early stage companies were meeting and were talking about the impact that you can have in a number of different areas. And I met after a presentation one of the founders of Winnow and convinced him that he should consider hiring me. And it was kind of fortuitous that they just raised a kind of seed round and
Hmm.
had some capital to start thinking about scaling up, and that seems like a long time ago now. We were, in a handful of kitchens at the time. Now we're in kind of over 1,400 locations in 45 countries, and it's been an incredible journey. But it really started by that one decision to say, well, if this is what you want to do, then you have to be there, you have to turn up, right? So I think that's
Hmm.
one of the key learnings to kind of anybody starting their career is just be there.
Yeah, I can't agree with that more. I think for me, my all of my early career has been through meeting people in person, right? Kind of random, quote unquote, random connections, right? Where you
Yep.
end up meeting people and it leads to something great. So, but anyways, let's get into Winnow a little bit. What can you just kind of explain to us again for a non-technical person, like anybody
Sure.
who's maybe not familiar with the industry, how does your technology work? Maybe some of the data points behind what you guys are solving,
Sure.
and just kind of walk us
Yep.
through that.
So why don't I start with the problem, and then we can kind of make sense of the technology
Hmm.
and why we've been building it. So food waste is an age-old problem for any commercial kitchen, for the hospitality industry at large. You're making food at some type of scale, and it's inevitable that you're going to have some type of wastage, right? One of the problems with food waste is that it's really difficult to measure. It's not practical to employ somebody to stand next to the bin and take lots of notes. And traditionally, the way that food waste was measured was kind of at the end of service. A chef or members of the team would create a waste sheet, and they would estimate the number of portions of particular dishes that were thrown away. They might enter that into some type of spreadsheet, but it was a pretty time-consuming process. The data was pretty unreliable, and then when the data was kind of entered into a system, it wasn't presented back to the team in a kind of insightful way that could drive change. So that's what we kind of set up to solve. The way our technology works, we've got a number of different solutions for different types of kitchens, but what we're best known for is our AI-enabled solution, Winnow Vision. And the way that works is effectively you're using the same type of technology that you find in a driverless car, for example, and you're teaching a machine to be able to see. Right. And the way that you teach that machine to see is you present lots of and you collect lots of images, and you label those images, and then you feed them through into a computer vision model. And then when there's enough data within that model, then we're able to predict with a new image what that item is. So for example, IKEA is one of our biggest customers, and they're pretty easy to understand. understand because most people have been to an IKEA kitchen. So at the end of a particular service, there might be some meatballs that are left over on the hot counter. The co-worker in IKEA then takes those, they throw them into the bin. There's a terminal that sits over the top of the bin that takes a picture, and there's a digital scale that sits underneath the bin, kind of capturing the weight. So as the meatballs are thrown away, there's a picture that shows the meatballs, and there's a weight that's captured because the scale knows there's been a change, and then X number of pounds have just been thrown away. In real time, the AI will predict what that item was. And so either it will identify, that item as meatballs, or it will present a range of a short list of options for the user to use a touchscreen and say, right, the AI thinks it's one of these 8 options. It's meatballs. Okay, we tap it and it's meatballs. And then we've captured a transaction. And in the cloud, we know the cost file, we know what the cost per pound or the cost per kilo of all of the different food items that you might find in that kitchen. And with those 3 pieces of information, the weight, the item, and the cost, we can then feed back in real time. That was, $12 worth of meatballs that was just thrown away. And then over the course of the service, we capture each one of those transactions. We then aggregate that in the cloud, and our analytics platform will give a report to the team the next day that pinpoints exactly where they lost the most money, where different kind of items were being wasted at what points in the day. And with that insight, we find that teams can typically cut food waste in half within about kind of 12 to kind of 24 months. So that's kind of a bit of a kind of pithy summary in terms of how the technology works. Why would anybody want to bring that into a kitchen? Well, our main data point, kind of crucially, going back to the fact that it's so difficult to measure, we traditionally in our industry used to underestimate the amount of food that's being wasted. So a typical kitchen might, in its accounts, have a line for say 3%, maybe 5% of all the food that gets purchased being wasted. But in reality, our data captured in over 1,000 kitchens shows that the real number is likely to be between 5 and 15% of all the food that's purchased. And in some cases, that can be 20% or more. So if we're able to cut that in half, that's a significant cost saving for the business while you're also doing the right thing for the environment as well.
Yeah, I guess I'd be curious could you give us, you mentioned the minor data points, but could you maybe on a larger scale, what are some of the data points?
Sure.
How much food is wasted per year? What does that equate to,
Sure.
carbon emissions, et cetera?
Yep. So on a kind of system level, if you think about the global food system, about somewhere between a third and 40% of all of the food that gets produced from farm to fork ends up being lost or wasted, which is, when you start thinking about that from a kind of just a scale perspective, is monumental. So it's another way of thinking about it would be, imagine a landmass the size of China, and then all of the food grown on that landmass being thrown in the bin every year. And so that is the scale of food waste on a global level. Clearly, from a kind of economic standpoint, that's not ideal. Some estimates will show $1 trillion or more being lost every year because of the food that's being wasted. And we prefer to see that as an opportunity. So if there's $1 trillion being lost, can we come up with new technologies, new processes to try and claw some of that back? And the reason that that's important from an environmental perspective, somewhere between 8 and 10% of global greenhouse gases come from food waste. So it is a significant proportion of our total global emissions. If you think about all of the energy that goes into growing food, kind of harvesting food, transporting food, cooling food, selling food, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, it's just a very, very heavy cost when it comes to carbon. The good news is that we have lots of tools available like Winnow to be able to make reductions. The food system is complex, and so there's lots of different places that food will be lost or wasted across the value chain. Within our kind of little slither of that, we estimate around $100 billion worth of food is lost in the hospitality sector every year. So that's the problem that we're working on. But the good news again is that we have the tools, we have the case studies, we have the the kind of traction in the right direction to know that we can solve this problem. So it's a massive problem. We have to solve it. From a kind of moral standpoint, you've got 800 million people who are who are malnourished or don't have enough food to put on the table. So from a moral standpoint, we have to fix this problem, but from an environmental one, we also have to fix it and fix it quickly.
Interesting. So there's a lot of things that it's kind of solving all at once. That's quite interesting.
Mm,
Would be keen to understand, could you, I mean, are there examples, and maybe not, it's not always the same for every kitchen, but on the economic benefits or return on investment typically
sure.
for investing in this software, and kind of, is this an ongoing product that people pay for? Or is it, kind of a setup cost? Kind of walk us through some of those kind of basics.
Yeah, so we work with lots of kind of larger businesses like IKEA in the retail space. We work with caterers like Compass Group and ISS Guggenheimer in the US. Hotels like kind of Hilton, Accor, IHG, and many others, and cruise ships and casinos as well. And what you typically find in those larger kitchens, as I said, is that you're wasting somewhere between 5 and 15% of the food that you buy. So let's take the midpoint there. So say you're wasting 10% of the food that you buy. You're going to use a tool like Winnow to reduce that food waste. And so now, after 12 months of using the system, harnessing the data, using the insights to drive operational improvements, you've now got that down to 5%. So now every year versus where you were pre-intervention, you've cut 5% off the top of your food purchasing costs, right? So that's where the kind of the value comes to the client, and that can be significant. If you think about the kind of wafer thin margins that many hospitality businesses are working to, that reduction in 5% of cost can be the difference between being in profit and being out of profit. From a return on investment perspective, so we charge a monthly fee for our technology. That there are different options for different types of kitchens that kind of vary in levels of complexity, but we typically expect to either kind of 2x at the low end up to 10x at the high end the savings versus our fees, right? So if we were delivering 100,000 in savings, we'd expect to at least we'd potentially be kind of delivering between 50,000 pounds of dollars worth of services down to say $10,000 in a really large kitchen where there's lots of waste and lots of complexity. So it depends on the type of kitchen. We tend to find that in kind of larger, more complex environments where perhaps you've got bigger teams, you've got multiple kitchens, perhaps there isn't a closed loop in terms of where the food ends up when it's wasted. The people who produce the food never see the food being thrown away. That the level of waste can be very high. But yeah, somewhere between 2 and 10 times our fees would be where we'd expect to benchmark.
And so, I mean, it sounds economically like it absolutely makes sense for probably most kitchens, right? Does this typically make sense for even smaller kitchens that are less volume?
Yeah, so we have kind of lighter touch solutions for kind of cafe, all the way down to kind of cafes and kiosks, kind of simple tablet-based measurement solutions. What we're finding is with some of the clients that I mentioned, they'll look to their larger sites or their larger hotels or resorts first because that's where the biggest opportunity is. But more and more, what we're seeing is the hospitality businesses are mandating that all of their kitchens at least measure food waste. And so what we're trying to build is a suite of tools that kind of dial up and down in terms of complexity and kind of the power of the technology based on the needs of each kitchen, that all feed into one single analytics platform. And so our vision is it doesn't really matter if you have kitchens that are spending $1 million plus on food versus those that are spending kind of 20k 30k 40k. It doesn't matter. We have a solution for every kitchen, and you can then kind of use Winnow to benchmark all of your sites, and at every single site you'll be able to make improvements that should drive economic benefits.
It probably, I'm assuming that especially the larger organizations, especially publicly traded, types of companies, they're probably getting to a point where because of the ESG reporting metrics, they're required to have some of these things. So not only is it needed, but it's also like it just makes sense. I'd also be keen. I feel depending on maybe the circumstances, there's I don't know the exact statistic, but I know a lot of restaurants tend to fail within 1 to 2 years. And I'd be keen to understand if this technology could really help that number to be a lot better, right? So there's a lot less failure. in the rest.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we're working towards as a business is what we call a kind of out of the box solution, right? So the way our technology, and in fact all kind of computer vision and machine learning products work, is you first have to collect data, you organize and you label that data, and when it's organized and labeled, then you're able to kind of access a predictive ability within the technology that can be of some value. At the moment, we're able to move from a kind of learning phase into a predictive phase within a matter of weeks, which means you'll install the system, the team will start capturing data, and then within 2 to 4 weeks, we'd expect to be able to turn the AI on and the team to benefit from that. In the future, as we build more and more data and our AI gets more and more accurate, it will be possible to install the terminal within a local Italian, a new restaurant that's just opened up, and the team will be able to get data that will be helpful for them immediately without having to do anything. And so that's really what we're kind of building towards. And so to go back to your question, yes, like if you can immediately reduce your food costs within a short space of time, prevent loss, and then reinvest, for example, for a restaurant that's just launched, maybe reinvest some of that budget into marketing, for example, or something that's going to improve customer satisfaction. That's hugely powerful, and that should then go to ensuring that businesses are more likely to be successful and survive straight off the bat. I think in the future and within the next 5 to 10 years, the kind of the benefit of having digital measurement of food waste within kitchens will become so obvious and so apparent that very quickly all kitchens will have to have this, because those that don't will be at a competitive disadvantage to those that do. And so I think if you kind of follow your diffusion of innovation, kind of your early majority, late majority, laggards, innovators, and early adopters, etc., we're very much at the beginning of that process. But we're starting to see much more volume of demand coming through from our customers for lots of different reasons. But as that accelerates, I think it will become the norm that everybody's measuring food waste, that everybody's using digital technology to minimize costs, and the business will be better off for it, and that will solve an important environmental problem at the same time.
Yeah, and I would also assume that, especially in the early stages, customers there might be a competitive advantage to just collecting and showing that we're reducing our food waste, or as a company, because then they can attract more customers who are environmentally conscious, right? They know that they're supporting something more than just a business, right?
100%.
Hopefully the food's good too, right?
Yeah, exactly. But on that, when you talk about the food being good, and then you talk about food waste, often we think about these things as separate, right? But actually, if you're really on top of the food that's being wasted, if you have good data that shows that you keep throwing this type of product away, or that you're wasting this type of product because it's being prepared, how cool would it be that you get a recommendation, you get an email in the morning and say, hey, listen, we've noticed that you're wasting this type of item from your prep kitchen. Did you think, could you think about using this in this type of dish? Here's a celebrity chef to show you how to prepare that. And I think where we could get to in using kind of smart recommendations to kind of bring together the creativity of chefs and kind of data points within what's actually happening in their kitchen, that's the best. That's the best example of where you can harness kind of chef's creativity and technology. So, for example, we have one client in the UK. They, through our system, found that they were wasting lots of peelings from parsnips in their kitchens, and the chefs got together and said, okay, well, what could we do with that? And they came up with a kind of dessert topping. So they deep fried the parsnip peelings, they dusted them with cinnamon and sugar, really delicious kind of topping, and then they put that on top of an ice cream dish that they served. And that's what we love to see. So where you've got teams using that insight to create something that's delightful for customers, that's delicious and that prevents waste, that's the kind of perfect marriage of what we do.
Then you get the little bit of upcycling in there. That's great. I love it.
Exactly.
What does the installation process look like? How hard is it to set up?
Sure. So it's pretty much a kind of plug and play type affair. So we need to take a few kind of specifics from a client before they proceed with an installation. We need to know a bit about their kitchen, where the technology is going to be installed, things like kind of access to Wi-Fi. But once we've got those kind of data points, we ship out the terminal. There's instructions for the client to be able to install the system. It's a couple of holes in the wall, a couple of plugs and wires that need to be connected, and then you're kind of off to the races. So the installation process is pretty straightforward, and we've worked really hard to make that as easy as possible. We also support teams with onboarding. There's kind of training, more typically that's done remotely now. So we are able to train up teams in how to use the system, either kind of through an online training, e-learning, and kind of where possible, kind of COVID permitting, with kind of physical face-to-face training. We'll first start by kind of communicating what we're doing and why, and it's really important to kind of win the hearts and minds of the culinary teams that we're working with. The way that we kind of see ourselves is Winnow is a great technology, but at the end of the day, it's a tool like any other tool that you'd find in a kitchen, and it's really up to the teams and the chefs to use that tool. They're really the ones actually driving the improvements. But if we can communicate why we're doing this, show them that it's easy to use, show them that it doesn't waste a lot of their time, that it's fast, and show them that this can help them to, both kind of be more efficient, and also perhaps to be more creative as well in terms of the way that they deliver their dishes to customers. We typically get a pretty good reaction. There is a period that we call our kind of baseline period. So we'll use the technology to measure what the real level of food waste is within the kitchen. We probably underestimate that a little bit. There's a kind of academic term called the Hawthorne effect. Effectively, when you start measuring behavior, you alter that behavior. So us coming in, installing, this kind of this box above the bin,
Yeah.
obviously is a change in behavior, but to the extent that it's possible, we try and brief the teams not to make any significant changes within that baseline period. We turn off certain features within the technology, so we don't show the teams the kind of monetary value of what they're throwing away until we're through that baseline period. And then we use that baseline period as the kind of line in the sand to then measure kind of future reductions against.
So generally speaking, does it seem that teams tend to adopt it pretty quickly? Has there been, instances where it was really a struggle to get people on board? Because I worked in a kitchen, or I worked for a restaurant at one point, and I know that some people might be a bit stubborn at times.
Yep. There's an old kind of saying at Winnow is that we don't tell chefs what to do because they're the ones who have the knives. I think that kind of I'm not kind of saying that in a disparaging way. It's a recognition that within a busy kitchen, in particular, given everything that the industry has been through over the last 2 years, new safety regulations, fluctuating demand, problems in the supply chain, problems accessing labor increasingly. That's a real problem for the industry. Food waste might be number 13 on the list of priorities, right? So our job is to make the technology as fast, as easy to use, as intuitive as possible, almost so it's kind of running along in the background. And every morning we pop up with a report for the team that's really useful to help them do their job. And so that's the approach that we take. We have been working for the last 8 years to make that technology as easy to use as possible. Launching the AI product is kind of part of a journey effectively to automate the entire collection process, away from chefs and people within the kitchen, so that they benefit from the analytics without having to do anything. Now, we're not quite there yet, but it takes a couple of seconds to record the food that's being thrown away. We communicate the benefits of engaging in the process, really clearly. We seek to find champions and people within the kitchen who are really invested in reducing food waste. Typically, there'll be, kind of 2 or 3 people when we go into a kitchen who say, thank God, like we really wanted to work on this problem, but we've never had the tools to be able to do it. So effectively what we're trying to do is just give those teams those tools. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that we have had, as everybody will have had when you're trying to create change at an organizational level, there are challenges that come with that. We find that it's important for there to be alignment all the way from, your kitchen porter, your kind of culinary team, your chefs, all the way up to the boardroom, right? And we need to have alignment at every level of the enterprise for us to be able to deliver change at scale. We ask that the leaders of the businesses that we work with make public commitments, that they communicate those where possible, that they reward and compensate their teams based on the performance. It's increasingly common for teams to be, compensated based on the environmental performance within a kitchen, as well as the financial performance. And obviously, where there are clear targets and measurement policies in place, it's very likely then that teams are going to engage in the product if they see the benefit. And so we can benchmark now in terms of the levels of engagement across all of our sites. We can see on a day-to-day basis how much they're measuring, and we can set up automation if we ever see that there might be a training need or some additional support that's required. But typically, no, we don't see resistance. Everybody seems to think it's a pretty good idea. There's lots of enthusiasm as we go into kitchens, and that's what we try and harness as much as we can.
Well, what about, I guess, during the sales process, have there been any kind of major objections to actually implementing this technology? I'm assuming there would be probably some, but I don't think they would be very credible, is my guess.
Yeah, I mean, like you're bringing a new technology into what has up until relatively recently been a fairly traditional workplace, right? So it's less common now, but kind of roll back 5 years ago when Winnow was installed in a kitchen, it would often be the first screen that was going into a kitchen. It may have been the first connected device that had gone into a kitchen. And with change and with new tools and technologies can come objections, right? Is it going to take a lot of time? That's one of the objections that we would always see from prospective clients, and that's why we've worked as hard as we can to make the setup process as light as possible, to make the actual kind of process of recording waste as easy as possible, to remove as many of the barriers, using technology like computer vision to make it easy for teams to get the data that they need. Other objections, am I gonna see savings, and that can be challenging sometimes to identify in a profit and loss account where the savings are, but we have good processes now that kind of highlight where those savings exist, and we have good kind of benchmarks for different businesses in terms of the benefits that they should expect to receive. We'll have a conversation up front with clients and say, right, if we're able to shave 2.5 points off your food costs, what do you want to do with that? Do you want to save it and bank it and improve the profitability within the kitchen? Do you want to reinvest it perhaps in better quality produce, which is what some kitchens like to do? Do you want to reinvest it in other areas like marketing or people? And those are some questions now that we know to kind of ask up front, and different businesses will have different objectives that they will have, and think accordingly. A 5-star luxury hotel might not be that interested in kind of improving the gross profit within the kitchen by a couple of points, but they might be really interested in putting on a new seafood buffet, for example, on a Sunday, which is going to kind of bring new people into the hotel and increase the customer satisfaction of the guests who are staying there. So it's really on a kind of case by case basis. But what's common is when we get underway, when we see reductions, when we see savings coming in, it's a good news story all round, regardless of whether or not you're interested in the financials, on the kind of food side or on the environmental side. There's a good story to tell.
Yeah, I guess maybe to shift gears, I think it all makes a lot of sense to me. And again, I think it's very clearly laid out, so I appreciate that. Maybe we shift a little bit to your thoughts, kind of on the maybe the broader systems for
Mhm.
food production and everything. Do you have any other kind of things that you're aware of that can be done to help reduce food waste across the entire supply chain, whether that's all the way at the farm, whether
Mhm.
it's localizing the supply chain? Like, I'm just kind of curious to hear your thoughts in the next 5 to 10 years, where you think things are going, and where you're at least personally maybe interested in seeing those improvements.
Yeah. So I think there's a debate happening at the moment in lots of different countries around how do we drive down food waste in our consumer facing businesses. How do we create a policy environment which is conducive to that, and should governments step in and, for example, mandate food waste reporting for businesses of a certain size? And I think, we were talking about kind of new ESG requirements, the appetite from the kind of investor class now to demand that large businesses are really doing the right thing when it comes to environmental performance. And I think we're moving to a point where most large businesses are going to be measuring food waste at a kind of organizational level. And I think then it becomes pretty compelling for regulators to say, right, well, if we're already seeing most businesses doing this, or they're on that journey, what would it mean if we were to mandate all, say, large and medium-sized food businesses to report on food waste? And I think as you start mandating reporting, you start to see system level change in that space. There's the old adage: you don't measure it, you don't manage it. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think the faster we can reach a place where all large food businesses are measuring food waste, I think that starts to have a kind of knock-on impact across the whole value chain. So I think that's the first piece, is like, are we going to see more countries mandate food waste reporting? I think that's a conversation that's happening in a number of different countries. Um, on the kind of consumer side, so in developed countries, a large part of the food that's wasted happens in the home.
Mm-hmm.
We've had in the UK, for example, RAP, which is a kind of global organization that focuses on waste, and has lots of activity happening in the food waste space, has shown pretty significant reductions by, behavioral change campaigns, communication campaigns aimed at individuals. You're starting to see more brands take a stance here. So Unilever and Hellman's Mayonnaise, for example, they ran an ad in the Super Bowl talking about food waste in the last couple of weeks. And so I think culturally, the faster we move to individuals being aware of food waste and taking action, and seeing that as something that they can do, that's positive when it comes to, reducing their own impact, in the same way that they would, recycle, and kind of segregate their plastics and different types of waste within their home, or they might transition away from a kind of meat heavy diet through to kind of alternative proteins. Minimizing food waste is something that individuals can do within the home, to reduce their overall footprint. And I think the more that we can do to create that culture, the better. And it's a complex problem that is pretty multifaceted. But the more that we can kind of engage with people in the home, the better a chance we're going to have. And then obviously, there's a myriad of different technologies that are going to have an impact, across different points of the food system. You've got businesses like Appeal. So Appeal Sciences, based in the US, they create a kind of biological covering for things like avocados and citrus fruit that massively extends the life of those items, and they're very quickly scaling up their technology to be able to kind of reduce waste in other items. You've got businesses like Wasteless. So Wasteless use kind of machine learning to present dynamic pricing within retail environments. So you've got, for example, a gallon of milk that's about to need to be taken off the shelves. That should obviously cost less than the same product that has a longer use by date. So there's lots of different solutions. There's not one silver bullet that's going to solve this problem.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the kind of last thing I would say is there's now a recognition in the in the kind of business community, both on the kind of corporation side and also at the startup scale up side, that there's a lot of money on the table here. There's $1 trillion worth of food being thrown away every year. Can we all kind of work together to try and claw some of that back? As I was saying earlier, can we look at this as an opportunity? I would encourage all businesses and investors to look at this as an opportunity, because the returns can be pretty significant regardless of where you are within
Mhm.
the ecosystem.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it feels like with this problem, it starts at the end, right, at the consumer level, right, within the restaurants, within the home.
Mm.
I'm very fascinated by the agriculture side of things, especially industrial agriculture and how it's not necessarily good for the soil and for the
Mhm.
environment as a whole. Do you have any thoughts? I know it's maybe a little bit off of your main area of focus, but do you have any thoughts or comments on this idea of kind of regenerative farming, and then potentially in that same vein, vertical farming, right, where you can
Mhm.
locate your produce growing in a city right next to the consumer source? Do you have any thoughts on that space?
Yeah, I think we clearly need to overhaul the way we're producing our food. Kind of monoculture, um, you know, from a number of different standpoints, um, isn't sustainable. Um, there are so many benefits to taking a regenerative approach, um, and I think in addition to that, we're rapidly urbanizing. We have, you know, for example, we have an office in Dubai. They're importing the vast majority of their food for obvious reasons in
Mm-hmm.
that part of the world. Bringing the production of food closer to cities in a way which is sustainable, um, can have massive benefits. And so, I mean, there was a recent kind of polling of the top 500 food tech companies. It's kind of unsurprising that many of the top 10 are vertical farming
Mm-hmm.
uh, uh, scale ups like Infarm and others. And the technology is there, it's scaling. There's a clear demand for it, and I think where, as in our case, where you can marry up the benefits from a sustainability perspective and also from an economic perspective, and in some cases from a food security perspective, I think you're going to see pretty significant change in the next kind of 5 to 10 years in this space.
Yeah, and I think the food security issue is something that I'm particularly interested in. I think geopolitically, obviously, this podcast doesn't focus on that, but I think geopolitically speaking,
Yeah.
it's very important, right, for a country like, for example, Dubai to be able to produce more of their food locally, right? And I think that's going to be possible. One of the companies I'm familiar with is App Harvest. They're in the U.S. They have a very
Yeah.
interesting product. But no, I think this is fascinating. I'm very interested. It's kind of this whole topic of food and
Mm.
agriculture is very close to my heart, given that both my parents were raised on farms. It runs
Yeah.
it runs in the family. But
Yeah.
but no, I think maybe one last thing, I guess, just to kind of top it off here would be in terms of the education side of things. I guess there's a couple angles we could look at here. So first of all, from the perspective of the talent going into the industry, like for
Mhm.
companies like Winnow, I know it's largely a technology company. But do you find that universities are doing a pretty decent job of actually making awareness of these technologies to help
Mhm.
actually feed graduates that are specialized in these areas, or are they coming from other
Mhm.
areas that have to kind of then relearn a few things before they can get into the space? What do you see happening there?
So I think it's a really good question. If we take the hospitality schools, who, if you think about, at least in Winnow's case, the future talent who are going to be making the big decisions in, say, 10 years' time, but who are going to have a massive impact um, in the way some of these larger businesses operate, from now onwards. It's clear that sustainability um, is essential in their development. It's embedded into curriculums. We work with a number of hospitality schools. We have one, for example, in France with a school called the Institute of Paul Bocuse. We work with a number of others based in countries like Switzerland and also in the US, where we're providing data, we're providing case studies, we're working with students to set kind of challenges within their curriculum where they work on real problems, and we can kind of show where food is being wasted in kitchens, and then kind of access their energy and creativity to come up with new solutions. And we get a positive reaction 100% of the time when we're
Mhm.
working with young people. So I think as we look forwards, I'm very hopeful that the growth of the hospitality industry is going to be sustainable, because
Mhm.
the young people coming into the industry now are passionate about that. They care about that. I mean, going back to the beginning of our conversation, we talked about purpose. I think now, if you're a large business and you can't clearly articulate your purpose, you don't have a well-defined set of environmental, sustainability, ESG, kind of policies, targets, initiatives, and that isn't transparent and accountable, you're going to find it difficult to access talent. Whereas the flip side is, and we get this from kind of some people within our space, if you can be really proactive, say you're a small chain of pubs and you have a net zero strategy, when people are looking for jobs, if you're the one that's doubled down on being responsible, having a really kind of progressive attitude towards sustainability, that's going to attract talent, and
Mhm.
talent that could have gone anywhere is going to come and work for you. So to kind of answer your question, yes, there's massive engagement on the academic side. It's a complex problem though, right? So, as you think about farming, as you think about agriculture, as you think about global food systems, as you think about consumer behavior, behavioral science, across a myriad of different disciplines, it really touches a large number of fields. And I think, we can't keep up with all of them, but we try and democratize our data as much
Mhm.
as we can, and open it up for academic institutions to work with and hopefully learn from.
Yeah, I think that's super important to me. I think that the thing that most interested me about the ESG and climate tech spaces, and that fascinated me to get into this area, was the fact that the everything is shared, right? It's all very
Mm,
transparent. And to me, like my whole goal generally coming into the business space was I wanted to build businesses that were based on honesty and transparency with the employees for first of all, and then of course
agreed.
with the customers. But I guess maybe one last thing is, I mean, maybe some comments from you on this. It feels like if we're really going to solve the problem, because it's all about the demand that we have and kind of the consumer behaviors, this to me seems like a clear, uh, I guess you could say, reason to maybe mandate something like in primary school or in grade school and high school, this understanding to educate people on food waste. Because if it's ingrained as a young age, understanding, hey, this is how much is being wasted, this is where like these things, they may not understand you know the economic aspects at first, but just understanding it's a waste. Do you see any initiatives being done with that to educate people at the very base level when they're forming these habits?
Yep. I think that's a really good point. I mean, we work with a number of schools, and we have our technology in a number of schools. Often those catering businesses who are um, providing services to schools come to us to try and create, learning
Mm,
opportunities for pupils. We have technology called Winnow Sense, which measures the plate, the food waste that comes back off plates, and
mm,
we put that into, we'll put that into universities. We can put that into schools. It can be something that, from a pretty young age, that young people can interact with and learn from. And I think I mean, obviously every school is teaching their pupils about climate change. The
mhm,
food system is a big part of that,
mhm,
and food waste is a big part of that. So we would actively encourage, every learning institution, right the way from primary through to secondary and universities,
mhm.
to make that a core part of the way they think about teaching different subjects. I guess one final point from a young person's perspective, it just when you talk to children about wasting food, it doesn't make sense to them. When you start talking about these kind of big pictures in terms of the level of food waste that we have, and then the number of people who don't have enough food to eat. And there's some really interesting kind of social experiment type content out there. One that really stayed with me was where they just set a camera up. They had a couple of kids come in. I think it might have been for a Spanish brand, and they had two cloches, two kind of, the big metal covers that you kind of lift off in a restaurant. And they'd lift the two cloches, and one had a sandwich there and the other one didn't, right? And so you had these two kids, one has a sandwich, one doesn't. And in all of the instances they did that, it was a very natural thing for the child that had the sandwich to, rip it in half and share it. And so there's something that's inbuilt within us, I think, or at least that we're indoctrinating into our children, to think about food as precious. And if we strip back all of the technology and all of the policy and all of the complexity within the food system, there's something that's inherent within us, that if somebody doesn't have food, that we should give them that food, and that food shouldn't be wasted. And I think that ultimately is why I'm hopeful, right, about us being able to solve this problem.
That's very powerful, honestly. I think it goes back to our basic instincts, right? We need to be nourished, right? I guess one last comment I did think of is that, especially I think restaurants are a place that a lot of people, food service in general, start working at early, like during university or in high school or whatever. And young people can be really big agents of change, right? If they see this technology, they're using, your technology and seeing, oh, wow, there's so much food being wasted. They might then go back and then, instill habits in either their own families when they start them, or within their existing households. But this is very interesting conversation. I really, really appreciate you coming on, David. And we'll definitely have to see you on again. I'm sure there'll be more products to come. I'm very keen to see how this space goes in the long run, but thank you so much for joining.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much, everybody, for listening to today's episode with David. Really hope you enjoyed it. If you would like to hear more, and this is your first time joining, please do subscribe and turn on notifications. Please, of course, do consider sharing this also with somebody else who might find this interesting. I'm guessing there's a lot of people who know restaurant owners who potentially could benefit from this, or restaurant managers. So please do share this with anybody who might find it relevant or might find it interesting. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, we always ask for, please, if you can, spare us a rating and a review. It really helps us to increase the reach of the show. And of course, as always, if you'd like to get more involved, you can join our Slack channel to be connected with other professionals in the space. It's an easy place to reach me as well. We have a lot of discussions in there from time to time, so a very interesting place if you're looking to get further involved. And then, of course, you could subscribe to the newsletter if you're interested in hearing a bit more of a deep dive into one topic every month. That comes out on the 27th of every month. And by the way, of course, if you're interested in writing, we always love to hear from guest writers for that. So please reach out for that as well. And then, of course, please do reach out to David, connect with him on LinkedIn. You can learn more about Winnow, especially if you or somebody you know is interested in the technology and checking it out. And you can learn more at their website as well. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach me on Twitter. That's a good place as well. And just a quick shout out for next week's episode. We will be hearing from Aaron Burnt, who is the head of energy partnerships at Google Nest. And we will primarily discussing how residential energy demand flexibility can really help to stabilize the grid and actually save homeowners quite a lot of money. So thank you again so much for joining us on today's episode of Clean Tech is the Podcast, and we will see you next week.